Good afternoon or good morning from Brussels. I'm Ian Lesser from GMF here in Brussels, and it's a great pleasure really to welcome you today to this conversation on priorities for the U.S. EU Summit. And I suspect we may even wind up talking a little bit about what follows the summit too, but clearly we designed this event, looking towards the summit that will take place next week in Brussels on June 15th. I think we'll all agree, a moment of great change. It has been a moment of great change in transatlantic relations, I think quite positive. It's a moment of optimism. It's a moment of great opportunity, but also I think we'll all agree a moment of global challenges, some of them very, very pressing. And so there will be a lot on the agenda, and there'll be an opportunity today to talk to two wonderful people. We couldn't really have a better group to talk to us about these issues here today. And we're really delighted to have with us Ambassador Stavros Lambrinidis, who's the EU ambassador to the United States, and also Molly Montgomery, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. And we're really delighted. Thank you both for taking the time to be with us. And we're also really delighted to have Martina Hrvolová, who is a non-resident fellow with GMF in Washington, with us to moderate this conversation. And before I turn it over to Martina so we can get started, let me also just say a word of thanks to two colleagues of mine, to Jonathan Katz, who really made this event happen, a senior fellow and director of our democracy initiatives in Washington, and also John Alexander. So thanks to them. Thanks to all of you again for joining us. And do tune in for Brussels Forum next week, if you'll forgive me a shameless pitch for that. It'll be very, very good. But clearly the U.S. EU Summit is the key thing to talk about. So with that, Martina, over to you, and thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind introduction, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. We at GMF are indeed honored to have two speakers who don't need much introduction, Molly Montgomery, and of course, Ambassador of the European Union to the United States, Stavros Lambrinidis. Molly Montgomery serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs at the U.S. State Department. She's responsible for relations with Western Europe and the European Union, and leads the Bureau's policy formulation and implementation on global issues. In the past, she also served as Special Advisor to the Vice President for Europe and Eurasia. Now, with only a few days left to the U.S. EU Summit, I'd like to ask you, Molly, first, what is on the agenda of this first in-person meeting of President Biden with President von der Leyen and EU leaders? What does the Biden administration want to accomplish at its first U.S. EU Summit? And what does a successful summit look like from Washington? Molly.
Great. Thank you, Martina. And just a huge thanks to start with to Ian and the whole GMF team as well. And it's great to be with all of you. I would just say that, as the president has said, America is back, and we're back in Europe. And, to be honest, I think there has never been a more important moment for U.S.-EU relations, because as we look at the state of the world and the challenges we face, whether COVID and economic recovery, climate, digital issues and emerging technologies, foreign policy challenges. These are all areas where the United States and the EU really stand to benefit hugely from working together to solve global issues, working together to set the rules of the road, and working together really to stand up for our shared values and our mutual interests. And so we're really approaching the summit with the desire to fulfill the president's commitment to rebuild relations with our allies and partners, the EU being incredibly important among them, and really to raise the level of ambition in our partnership with the EU. And so the agenda for the summit will include issues like global health security, the global economic recovery, climate change, digital and trade cooperation, democracy and human rights, and areas of mutual foreign policy concerns such as China, Russia, and Iran. And so what we are really hoping to do is to just lay a solid foundation for the cooperation that we want to see at this really ambitious level over the next 4 years. And we look forward to a really successful summit that lays that foundation again for cooperation based on our shared values and interests. And I think based on that, really the sky's the limit in terms of what we can do together.
Thank you. With that, I'd like to turn to Ambassador Lambrinidis. Again, doesn't need much introduction. He has been the ambassador of the European Union to the United States since 2019. Prior to that, he was also the European Union Special Representative for Human Rights, Vice President of the European Parliament, and Foreign Minister of Greece. In short, he devoted much of his life to international cooperation, and we cannot wait to hear from you, Ambassador. What practical results beyond assurances of the strong partnership between the US and EU can we expect? What does the EU Commission President von der Leyen and member states want to accomplish at its first summit with the new US administration that is calling for closer EU-US cooperation? What does a successful summit look like from Brussels? Ambassador, could you please unmute yourself?
There we go. Okay, so great to be with you. Thank you, and great to be with Molly as well. I would say in a nutshell that from our side, we understand that we have two fundamental audiences for this summit. One audience is domestic, is our people, Europeans and Americans, and for that audience, it's extremely important for us to be able to show that the transatlantic alliance delivers for our citizens security and prosperity in a way that going it alone never could. In other words, that we are stronger together. And the second audience, of course, is an international audience. We should have no doubt that everyone around the world will be focusing on this summit. And for that audience, it's very important for us to be able to send a message that the world should stand up and take notice of the fact that Americans and Europeans are working together to address some of the greatest global challenges. And if your concern is global poverty, getting out of the terrible recession caused by COVID, ensuring that your people can be vaccinated no matter where you live, and no matter how rich or poor they are, ensuring that human rights are protected, then you can look up to that alliance and to that summit on the 15th of June and feel hopeful. And if your hope is to spread authoritarianism around the world, well, then you should stand up and notice then as well, because this alliance will do everything it can to stop this from happening. And as far as I'm concerned, there are four broad themes that we will be focusing on. The first one is that the EU and the US together are the biggest economic locomotive of the world. We are the biggest providers of good, strong jobs to our own citizens through the investment and trade that we have with each other, the biggest investment trade relationship in the world. We will work together to strengthen and to reform the WTO, and we have to do this to ensure that there are fair rules of the trade game around, and we will do this with partners, that we are capable of resolving quickly and effectively our bilateral trade irritants, that we can work and will work, and I expect that we will have this in the summit as an announcement, together to address the new challenges that sit on the nexus of technology, trade, and security. Everything from artificial intelligence and the standards for AI in the future to cybersecurity, to export controls and what have you. A second big pillar is that the EU and the US, and if you like, democracies more broadly, are the best providers of global public goods. And that is where I expect we will be discussing the issue of climate change and how it is that we can work together to raise not just our own internal ambition, but also the ambition of other countries around the world to address this major challenge. I expect that vaccine coordination, both at the G7 level and at the EU-US Summit, will be very strong and a very strong message to countries around the world. I expect that connectivity, how it is that you can have fair investments around the world, from building bridges to building roads to building hospitals to building what have you, can really work to the benefit of the people on the ground, and not for corruption or for the few. And so that is a global public good agenda that I think is going to be very important. The third agenda I think is going to be important is going to be that the EU and the US together are the biggest security and peace providers in the world. And everything has to do from cybersecurity, again, the new hybrid challenges of the world, how NATO and the EU itself, through its new military defense initiatives, can become together with the US even stronger security providers. Looking at immigration and migration and the root causes of it, and making sure we protect people from those root causes that force them very often to leave everything behind and try to seek an uncertain future, but also protecting them from war and from repression. Working together on sanctions is going to be very important. Let me say finally then, of course, we do have the human rights agenda. The EU and the US are the two biggest providers of human rights and human dignity in our own people and throughout the world. And that's going to be a very, very big part of the agenda. We can talk about this a little later as well, if you want to, but I would highlight that we are the biggest development and humanitarian donors in the world by far, Europe and the United States. And that is aid that educates girls and boys, that brings clean water where it doesn't exist, that does build roads and bridges. I mean, we do this with civil society, hand in hand. We talk to civil society, we support civil society, and this you will see even more strongly happening. And finally, in this fourth pillar of human rights and democracy, we are taking care of our own democracies as well. There are many challenges around. We have to discuss them, including in our own countries, our own democracies, and democracies are not afraid of addressing those challenges. Autocracies are. You never get anyone to discuss the challenges there. Democracies are not afraid, and we are not afraid, and we will send that signal.
Thank you, Ambassador. And thank you also to Molly for the preview of what looks like a very busy agenda. So it's really exciting to hear that there are a lot of topics to be discussed next week in Brussels. Before asking both of you my second question concerning democracy and human rights, I'd like to encourage our audience to begin posing your own questions in the Q&A box. Now to my second question, Molly and Ambassador Lambrinidis, both the US and EU have been clear that democracy and human rights are among their joint priorities. Will the democracy agenda of upholding the rule of law, combating corruption, promoting human rights, both domestically and internationally, including in the US and the EU, be discussed? What can be done to advance democracy and human rights on both sides of the Atlantic and globally by the US and EU individually and jointly? Will we see any new commitments, maybe both politically and in terms of assistance to address these challenges? Molly, would you like to go first?
Sure, thank you for that. And just to say, I really appreciate Stavros's lay down as well of the agenda, and I think, his expression of the broad human rights agenda really hits the mark. I would just say that this administration, for us, our values and principles of human rights, democracy, the rule of law, fighting corruption, these are really through lines to everything that we are doing, not just in terms of foreign policy, but domestically as well. And so we really approach these issues with a great deal of humility, as we know that we too need to work to strengthen and renew our democratic institutions. And so this is an area where we really look forward to working with the EU, and we've seen some great cooperation already just in the first few months of the administration. We are really glad to have been able to partner with the EU as well as other like-minded countries such as the UK and Canada on human rights related sanctions on Russia and China. Through the G7 and in other multilateral fora, we have stood up for human rights and spoken out against abuses, again, in places like Russia, China, Belarus, Myanmar, Burma, and elsewhere. And so we look forward to working together, both bilaterally and in multilateral institutions, and multilaterally with like-minded countries to stand up for these shared values. I mean, it is a core element of our partnership, and it's something where we have the ability to use our shared economic might to serve those values. And I think we really look forward to continuing to build on the close cooperation that we have had so far. I also think, there's a real opportunity with this administration and our focus on equity and fighting discrimination to partner with the EU on those issues, because we have seen that this commission has taken steps forward to address discrimination at home and abroad. And we really do appreciate the Commission's first strategy on LGBTQ plus equity, its anti-racism action plan, and action plans on gender equality and women's empowerment, and strategy on persons with disabilities. And so I think we view this as really an area where we can continue to grow our cooperation based on our shared values. And again, it's just really going to be a through line of so many of the topics that we discuss at the summit, as well as obviously standing on its own right, because Stavros is right that, when we look at so many of the issues around the globe, a lot of this is about ensuring that democracies deliver, that democracies protect the rights of our citizens, and that democracies also stand together and push back against those who don't share our values, who are not protecting the rights of their citizens. And so this is really core to so much of what we're doing in our own societies, as well as pushing back against authoritarian regimes.
Thank you, Molly. Ambassador, can I bring you in on this one?
Yes, thank you. Although Molly put it very, very well. I would say I would emphasize the importance that I place on our work on a multilateral level, which is why I'm also supremely pleased with the re-engagement of the U.S. administration with the Human Rights Council and with other multilateral institutions, because what we tend to forget when it comes to human rights is that there are some countries around the world that are simply dedicated violators of rights for ideological or political reasons. And then there are some countries that are dedicated protectors of rights because of their own ideologies or histories. But there are many countries that are neither here nor there exactly in this debate. They maybe more sit on the fence. They don't really want to violate human rights, but sometimes they do. They try to go down a democracy path, and sometimes that's an easy one, sometimes a tough one, sometimes there's a danger for sliding back. And if we're going to be successful in this effort around the world, we have to be able to appeal and to make sure that those countries sitting on the fence don't fall on the wrong side of the fence. And that kind of approach, that kind of discussion is very sophisticated, very difficult. It's not just simply going and advocating that, democracy is great, therefore the debate is open. You have to be able to give incentives. You have to be able to build institutions in those countries. Sometimes there simply is no capacity to have independent courts unless you help them put them together, assuming they want them. And in many cases they do. There's no civil society NGO law that protects civil society, but there are many people who wish to see how they can do this. Free elections and how you manage to put them together and to observe them is a challenge, because some of these countries have new democracies and struggling. So to me, this is a very big issue, multilateral cooperation and ensuring that we're able to approach countries, not simply putting them in front of a divide, one side or the other, and pick immediately, but trying to ensure that, as I said, they don't fall in the wrong side of the fence. A second thing I will focus on is, indeed, as Molly said, human rights sanctions, which is the flip side of the previous coin. In some instances, especially when you have to do with dedicated human rights violators, you have to make sure that there can be a cost to be paid for that commitment to violating rights. And that's where the European Union has come also recently in with its own human rights sanctions regime that we applied first in the case of Navalny in Russia, but also in other countries. A third thing I would focus on is our own domestic human rights and democracy agenda. We have a lot of discussion to do, and we have been doing it quite extensively in Europe on how we deal with issues of disinformation. In other words, with intentional attempts to lie in order to divide a population, in order to make it incapable of talking to each other. And the biggest undermining of democracy is, in fact, to have a population that feels that democracy is a zero-sum game. Democracy is never a zero-sum game, should never be. And if people cannot talk to each other, if they hate each other, then even if you have democracy nominally, the bad guys have won. So trying to see how we deal with those really difficult issues, protecting freedom of expression fanatically, as we do in democracies, but ensuring that people internally or externally do not try to use the same tools of democracy to burn it up. That's a tough and interesting discussion to have. How to deal with inequalities, how to deal with racism in our societies, how to deal with social safety nets and ensure that we strengthen them so people don't fall behind. So COVID doesn't hit. And if you happen to be poor, if you happen to belong to a minority, the chances that you die are bigger than if you're not. I mean, these are things that democracies have to address directly to also demonstrate that we deliver for our people much more effectively than those who repress. So, fascinating agenda. I cannot imagine a better time for the EU and the US to work together on this, and I look forward to it.
Thank you. And I believe our audience is looking forward to it as well. I see from the Q&A that the audience is interested in a great variety of issues. So let me start maybe with the question on human rights and democracy agenda. Many of our participants are asking what exactly is going to be on the agenda of the U.S. EU Summit. And I saw specifically North Korea, Myanmar, Burma, Poland, or even Hungary on their list. Is this something that you could comment on, or to put it differently? We all know that the United States and the European Union share interests in advancing democracy and human rights. So, is there any joint action that both sides are planning as far as democracy and human rights are concerned in some of these countries? How could these shared interests, both domestically and foreign policy interests, translate into any specific action? Molly, may I invite you to comment on this?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I think as we both laid out, there's really a robust agenda that's going to cover a number of topics, particularly in the area of foreign policy, and human rights and democracy will be key among those topics. And so I certainly expect that a number of the topics that you have referenced will be on the menu. I think we're not going to get ahead of any specific deliverable announcements at this point, but we really do expect this to be a robust conversation. And as Stavros said, human rights and democracy will be a big part of that, and a pillar in and of itself, as well as really, again, a foundational piece of all that we are working on together.
And I would add that you may have seen more recently that has been quite a bit of coincidence in the timing of the unrolling of some sanctions for human rights violation around the world, whether it is in the case of China and Xinjiang, or whether it is in the case of Russia with Navalny, or whether it is other countries around the world. And now, of course, we're looking very closely at the situation in Belarus, as you can imagine. I expect that our friends listening in understand that this didn't just happen, that this indicates a great desire to ensure that when sanctions are used, they're used in a way that they can send the maximum message and therefore carry the maximum impact against those, as I said, who are committed in violating rights and who have to feel the cost for that. I would also mention that we have been in Europe focusing very closely to President Biden's announcement of his interest in convening a summit for democracy in the end of the year or maybe early next year. And at any rate, more broadly on thinking about how we can address specific issues relating to democracy, whether it is human rights, whether it is strengthening our own democracy, whether it is fighting corruption. And I do expect that these issues will certainly be discussed in the summit as well.
Thank you. And I think you also already alluded to whether Russia will be discussed or not. There is a lot of interest in this as well. It goes back to my question on shared foreign policy interests. There are differences in how both the US and EU view partnerships with Russia and China, developments in these countries, and actions that these countries take internationally. So may I follow up on this first question and ask you specifically if Russia, China will be on the agenda, and if so, is there anything that you could share, any insights to give us a sense of what the leaders plan to discuss next week?
Well, can you imagine an EU-US summit speaking about all the major topics of the world where Russia and China would not be on the agenda? I mean, of course, they will be discussed as many other countries, and they will be discussed. Something that people don't know, perhaps, because it was very recent, is that on the 26th of May, there was the first session of the EU-US dialogue on China. That's something that was agreed between High Representative Borrell and Secretary Blinken during the first meeting, and it took place in Brussels. And the approach to that was to really look at all the elements of the relationship that we have with China. The elements that point to very strong competition, economic competition, and very often very unfair competition on the part of China. You know, the massive state footprint on the economy and how that gets multiplied and exported to countries around the world. Harming our own companies and you know, that are competing fairly in an open market without, you know, the massive subsidies. It has to do with dealing with areas where there is a systemic rivalry, where in fact China is trying to export its own governance model and its own human rights model around the world, where that has to be stopped, and has to be stopped collectively through very focused and very strong action. It also looked at the areas where we can cooperate with China. Areas such as climate change. It will not surprise you. I mean, climate change cannot be addressed unless China is fully on board and moves forward with its own plan under the Paris Agreement, or non-proliferation or other things like that. So I expect we'll be talking very extensively about those and other countries in the summit, and we'll be doing it not in a kumbaya way. We're not going to just be sitting back and saying, oh, look at this country, oh, isn't this terrible, look at this country, isn't this nice? I expect we'll be talking about how Europe and the US together will be able to encourage all the positive changes that we can, together with other partners and allies around the world, and how we can discourage forcefully all the negative actions.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on some of what Stavros has said, and I really agree with a great deal that he has said so far. I think, so on China, I was there for the first meeting, high-level meeting of the U.S. EU China dialogue, and I think we were all struck by just how much there was to discuss, and frankly, by how close you know, our perspectives are in many ways on China, and that we do both see our relationships as multifaceted. And as this administration has said, you know, we welcome the competition with China. We will look for areas where it makes sense to engage, and certainly climate, as Stavros said, is a big one. But we also recognize that there are times when that relationship will be adversarial when it needs to be. But I think that we have really found common cause on a transatlantic basis in terms of standing up to the PRC's human rights abuses and coercive economic practices, disinformation, and in other areas. And so I only expect that our cooperation will continue to grow as we have seen really such an increase in the convergence in our perspectives on the PRC over the last few years transatlantically. On Russia, I think this president has been very clear that we approach Russia in a very clear-eyed manner, and we are determined to address Russia from a position of strength. But at the same time, we all would benefit from a more stable and predictable U.S.-Russia relationship. And I really can't imagine a more of a position of strength to go into a U.S.-Russia summit than having just spent the previous almost week really talking to our allies and partners about this and many other issues. And so I think we really look forward to having the conversation in Brussels, both at the EU and NATO summits about Russia and how we can collectively address the challenge that Russia poses in terms of its destabilizing and aggressive behavior abroad, but also its human rights abuses at home and increasing authoritarianism. And we just look forward to having those conversations in Brussels, as a precursor to the summit, and then of course to consulting closely with our allies and partners in Europe afterwards. And so we expect this to be a continuing dialogue, but certainly, I think we have a common sense that we really do need to address Russia from a position of strength, with a clear eye again as to what the Russian agenda is, and again with just sort of a strength of purpose in terms of standing up for our shared values and interests, and particularly for our partners such as Ukraine that are facing Russian aggression.
Thank you. And thank you also for your patience here with me. These are the questions that are coming from our audience, and so I'm trying to make sure that we cover them all. But yeah, indeed, Ambassador, it's hard to imagine that the next week would not address some of these issues that you just discussed. Now, if you allow me, I'd like to shift gears here a bit and move to, let's say, the trade issues. Our audience is asking, in brief, if it's reasonable to expect any practical results as far as the Airbus-Boeing dispute or tariff issues are concerned from the next week's meeting. And I would probably broaden this question a bit to ask also about digital taxation. What's needed to overcome differences on topics where the US and EU have divergent views, such as on digital taxation and some other issues that I already mentioned. I believe there are avenues that can be used for a debate of such issues that would ensure that the atmosphere is inclusive and productive to prevent, escalation of actions on both sides moving forward. So again, back to the original question, is there any light at the end of the tunnel? Who wants to take this question first?
I'll jump in.
Thank you.
That's Molly's line too. Look, of course there's light at the end of the tunnel. I think fundamentally what we have to understand is the two biggest open free economies in the world, out of which our companies, our workers, and our consumers are profiting more than by dealing with anyone else in the world. Those economies cannot be fighting with each other. People standing around the world and looking at us fighting in the past few years when we did, they pop open bottles of champagne when that happens. Fundamentally, what we have to do is to stop imposing tariffs on each other, punitive tariffs, and this is something that I believe there's definitely a light at the end of the tunnel. So you may have seen that with the Biden administration taking over, we immediately had an agreement to suspend tariffs on Airbus Boeing for 4 months and to work together to resolve this dispute. This is supremely important. We both lost our cases at the WTO. And as we continue fighting, there are other countries out there, including, I have to say, China too, with this massively subsidized economy that are producing wide-bodied aircraft fully subsidized. And we are sitting back, and instead of trying to address that issue, we have wasted a lot of time addressing each other. So I am hopeful that the discussions that we are having, very serious discussions, can result to a successful outcome soon. A second dispute out there is the tariffs that were imposed on Europe for steel and aluminum, the so-called national security tariffs. Now, these tariffs, in our view, we said from the beginning, are not legal, and we were forced to come out with our own counterbalancing measures, our own tariffs, if you like, on U.S. goods that hurt the U.S. economy in the same way that the initial tariffs hurt the EU economy. Absolutely no reason, as we're trying to come out of COVID, to be continuing with that as well. So we decided as EU that we were going to, make a very important, strong gesture. We were not going to increase, as we had the right to, our own countermeasures in the beginning of June. We would freeze those for a period of time in the hope of finding a solution to this issue, which means of lifting the U.S. Initial national security tariffs and then lifting, of course, our own countermeasures immediately, and addressing the real underlying problem, which is Chinese steel overcapacity. I mean, that is what the problem is. China is producing massively, overproducing because of its subsidizing that production, and that is creating an unbelievable overcapacity that then is being flooded in the rest of the world, including the EU market. And the EU is as hurt by this as the US is. So this is a very serious issue, and we are discussing that as well. So am I hopeful? Sure. I mean, my job is to be hopeful, but it's beyond that. I know that the level of conversation and discussion is very detailed and very deep, and I hope that we can have a resolution to both these things to the benefit of our workers and our consumers and our businesses on both sides of the Atlantic very soon.
Yeah, I would really agree with a lot of what Stavros said, and I think we are very much on the same page in terms of both the large civil aircraft and the steel and aluminum tariffs, that the base problem really does come in terms of Chinese subsidies. And so I think working together to try to resolve these issues with that as sort of a foundational understanding of the problem is going to be really key. I also, and obviously we share the hope of being able to do that. And I think we have been part of the key to our robust cooperation on so many issues so far has been that we've been able to de-escalate these bilateral irritants. And I think we certainly hope to do so in the future, to resolve them where we can't, to de-escalate them, and always to keep the lines of communication open and constructive. And that will really be the key to allowing us to move forward on this huge affirmative agenda that we have, while recognizing that there will always be areas of friction and tension, but it's all about managing those while keeping the bigger picture in mind. I'll just mention a couple of other areas. One is Privacy Shield, where we have also intensified our cooperation and the negotiations around that issue to try to reach a resolution. This is something that this administration feels is really urgent. We hear it from companies and research institutions and educational institutions on both sides of the Atlantic. And it's something that we really do hope to find a resolution to soon, and is going to be certainly high on the agenda in terms of trying to find a way to break through there, because we know that those data flows, being able to count on them, is really critical to so many businesses on both sides of the Atlantic. And so I think what you really see in all of these areas is, again, just a commitment to try to find a resolution to many of these issues that have proven to be obstacles to deeper cooperation in the past. I also will just note that I think one area we're very excited about is cooperation on the reforming the global tax infrastructure. We were really excited to see G7 foreign ministers agree over the weekend to a robust global minimum of at least 15% in terms of corporate taxation. And we have also paused any tariff implementation on digital service taxes to give space for the conversations that are happening at the OECD on these issues. And so this is an area where we, again, hope that we can see a resolution to what had become a significant bilateral irritant, as well as really creating a once in a generation, or taking advantage of a once in a generation opportunity to reform the rules of the road in terms of global taxation and prevent a continuing race to the bottom. So that's something we're really excited about working toward as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. One follow-up question, which is really touches some of the points that are at the intersection of all of these important issues that we already discussed, is a question, again, that comes from our audience of disinformation plays a very important role in our everyday lives. So our audience is asking if the U.S. and EU plan to collaborate to fight disinformation in any ways, and if there are any announcements to be made at the summit next week.
Well, I would say yes, we are absolutely committed to fighting disinformation together, but I cannot make any statements about what announcements may or may not happen next week. I mean, that's something that our capitals are discussing now. But it is an issue that we have identified increasingly together as an issue that has been undermining our democracies and also can be very dangerous in practice. I mean, when you look at the disinformation that was going around initially about COVID itself and how dangerous or not dangerous it really was, and then about vaccines. And if you look at all the types of entirely unscientific information that is being peddled in order to divide and conquer our societies, I mean, this is really dangerous stuff. I mean, this may actually result in people dying because they are following the kind of information that is intentionally, designed to make them go down that dangerous direction. Democracy is the toughest political system. Authoritarianism that's easy. You just have a guy. He's usually a guy, standing up there, beating up people, making up decisions with a small circle of a bunch of other guys. And as a citizen, you simply, you either like it, in which case you probably lead a life, or you don't, in which case you probably are just always in fear. Democracy, on the other hand, requires every single individual citizen to be able to be informed, to follow the actions of their governments, and to make a decision every so many years about whether or not they like those actions or they want to change their government. That's tough. That requires a tremendous amount of engagement. It requires the ability to be able to not agree all the time on every piece of information out there, but at least have a sense of a common space, of a common square of debate where some facts can be more or less accepted because we have vetted through them, through processes that we trust, not because someone decided to just throw them out there, and some algorithm decided to multiply them by 1 million times, right? And it also requires democracy the difficult task of knowing how to talk to each other when we even disagree. And two, fundamentally as well, ensure that in the end of the day, and this is perhaps the toughest thing, isn't it? That the winner will take care of the minority, of those who didn't win. In a democratic system, it is not winner takes all. And that is really difficult. I mean, it's almost counterintuitive, right? So I won. Why should I care about you who lost? Well, I mean, that's what democracy is. That's what it does. That's why we protect human rights of minorities and others. Minorities. It's a smaller number, right? So that's tough. And that requires cooperation. And Americans and Europeans historically and today, have an existential interest in ensuring that we can make sure that this system works, and that big social platforms, when they stifle competition because they're huge gatekeepers, and innovation. And if we stifle innovation and competition in our own economies, my God, I mean, then I'm really scared about what others who are, state funding state champions can do. So we have to keep innovation alive. And there we are coming closer together on what it means to hold data, what it means to respect the privacy, of data, what the real value of data is, how we should make sure that others can have it so they can innovate as well. That kind of discussion, I think, is very important. The disinformation is important. So yes, there will be a discussion on this. Hopefully a shorter discussion than what I just said.
I think you've covered it, Stavros, and I really just agree that we see a really broad affirmative agenda on digital issues that includes not just disinformation, where I would say we actually already have quite strong cooperation that has been built over the last 5 years or so. But also, as Stavros mentioned, certainly there are a number of areas in terms of privacy, freedom of expression, ensuring, a free, open, secure, interoperable internet, and the protection of, human rights online. So lots of areas for further discussion. Obviously, our leaders can't get into huge depth on each of these issues, in a brief summit. But again, areas where I think we're going to see deeper cooperation in future.
Thank you. Thank you very much to both. Now, before we get to the closing remarks, I would like to ask you probably one last question from our audience, and I hate to do this because this has been a really fascinating conversation. But one very important question is, of course, the engagement of the U.S. Congress and the European Parliament. So one of our guests today is asking, what efforts are the United States and the European Union making to involve the US Congress and the European Parliament in debates, decisions, implementation of the decisions on these important issues we're discussing today? So that's a question to both of you. Molly, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, obviously, Congress plays a very important role on both sides of the Atlantic, or Congress and the European Parliament. And we, certainly welcome interparliamentary engagement. And we obviously engage regularly with our Congress on all of these issues. Secretary Blinken was just up on the Hill yesterday, speaking at some budget hearings, and a number of these issues came up. So certainly an important role to play, and particularly as the conversations that we're having have implications in terms of legislation. I think certainly this administration really also is trying to do more to integrate our foreign and domestic priorities, and a number of the issues we've touched on today really are related to that in terms of ensuring that we're renewing our democratic institutions, that we are delivering both in terms of our economy and our democracy for our citizens. And so I think this domestic perspective that Stavros talked about that we have on both sides of the Atlantic is really, there are a lot of commonalities in terms of the urgency that we feel to deliver for our people. And that's really the focus of the president's desire to have really a foreign policy for the middle class. So we're certainly keeping all of that in mind as we head into the summit.
Yes, and I would add the President Michel of the European Council, President von der Leyen of the European Commission, have made that kind of discussion a priority of theirs, also in their outreach, both around the world, but also domestically in the European Union as well. Parliaments, the European Parliament in Europe holds the Commission and legislation and co-legislates with the European Council, and that kind of daily exercise of democratic power is what differentiates Europe and the United States. What makes us, we feel, stronger, because we always keep the feet of those in power on the coals. And those legislators working together is for us a driving engine of this relationship. There is a transatlantic legislators dialogue that is established. I hope that in the U.S. Congress case, the dialogue team can become more ingrained in the congressional system, become a real sort of permanent committee that will allow for permanent members, as the European Parliament has, because then that cooperation can become even deeper. Every topic on the agenda that we are discussing here has to learn from our parliamentarians. I mean, when we dealt with the general data protection regulation, data protection issues, these are issues that the European Parliament in the end passed. These are issues that are being discussed at the US federal level as well, as more and more states come out with their own privacy laws, and there's a greater urgency to ensure that there may be a federal level legislation, so they're not 50 different types. The interest that I see from legislators, from congressmen and women, from senators in the US to speak to legislators in the European Parliament has increased, I have to say, dramatically over the years. And finally, let me say I'm very proud to announce that we will be relaunching the European Union caucus at the House on the 30th of June. So we timed it right after the summit. We look forward to having an even deeper cooperation with Congress as we strengthen this relationship.
Thank you, Ambassador. These are all the great news. And I wish we had more time to continue our conversation. Unfortunately, we have a hard stop at 10:30. So if you allow me, I will now conclude the Q&A session and turn to you for any concluding thoughts you may have as we get close to the end of our time together. There's so many other topics we wish we could cover, such as climate or even defense issues. So I'll leave it up to you really to decide what messaging do you want to prioritize in your concluding remarks. And we should probably start with Molly, if that's okay.
Sure, thank you. Well, I'll just touch on a couple of issues that, as you said, we haven't spent as much time on, and where I saw there was some interest from the audience. So first, I would just say climate is such a huge shared priority. I think we haven't talked about it that much because we're so much in lockstep about the urgency of addressing the climate crisis and about the steps that we need to take leading to the COP26 this fall. And so I think it's an area that will certainly be a big topic of conversation where we're moving out together. We look forward to taking action together and to trying to really raise the level of ambition in terms of the commitments that we see going into COP26. So I think that's an easy one. I can leave that there. I wanted to touch on the Western Balkans also briefly to just say this is really an area where traditionally we have seen terrific cooperation between the United States and the EU. And we know that things happen, good things happen when we link arms and work together. And so we have been working, Matt Palmer, my colleague, who covers the Western Balkans, and Mira Lajčák have been working together hand in glove over the last few months on issues such as the EU facilitated dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia. We certainly, as well, I saw a mention of Bosnia, a place very close to my heart, are following things closely there. Hope to see the talks proceed with North Macedonia and Albania. And really, our view is that it's just critical that these accession talks move forward in order to maintain the credibility of enlargement as an option for the region. But we really look forward to working together on a transatlantic basis in the Western Balkans moving forward. And then finally, just on defense, I mean, we were very excited to receive an invitation to participate in the Dutch-led military mobility project, which is the first European defense project that we will be involved with as a third state. We look forward to, as Secretary Blinken and HRVP Borrell agreed a few months ago, the fullest possible participation by the United States in European defense initiatives. Of course, from our perspective, we need to ensure that European defense, is distinct from NATO's core tasks, but we look forward to continued cooperation in this area. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And I'd say all these great, very important topics. So thanks, Molly, for raising them as well. And I agree that there's a lot of cooperation to happen in all three. From my side, I would just say, look, again, this summit is going to be a unique opportunity to show to our own people, regular Americans and Europeans, working families, business people, our consumers, simple citizens, that we are stronger together, that we are the biggest providers of security and prosperity outside of what we do in our own borders to each other's economies and people than we have anywhere else in the world in terms of alliances. I hope this is going to be an opportunity to show and to work together concretely on promoting security and peace more effectively in our region and around the world. I hope that we will be able to agree, communicate, and succeed in providing global public goods, from vaccines to pharmaceuticals, to environment and climate protection, better than anyone else, and faster and more effectively. And I hope that we'll be able to promote the agenda of human dignity and human rights and democracy more effectively. I think we'll be able to do all these things. Europe and the United States are very different than what we used to be a few years ago. Europe coming out of this crisis is more united. It is stronger. It is investing massively in a new growth, a green growth, and a digital growth. It is investing massively and more together in defense and security. It is becoming, in that sense, an even better partner for the United States than was the case in the past. And the United States is different. It is re-engaging with the world and with alliances. It is sending the message that American people are better off working together with Europeans than they would be alone, facing a world that is changing. In some areas is more opportunistic, more interesting, more hopeful. In other areas, more dangerous. And when we are together, we are stronger. And that's what I think is going to come out of this summit. And I look forward to working with Molly the day after, over sleepless nights, to make sure that we implement everything that our leaders decide has to be implemented.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these really great words of wisdom. There is a lot to observe. And so on behalf of GMF, I would like to thank you sincerely for sharing your insights, Deputy Assistant Secretary Molly Montgomery and Ambassador Lambrinidis today. You were very generous with us with your time. We're looking forward to see what the next week holds for the U.S. EU relations. And with that, let me also thank you for everyone that joined us today. Don't forget to check our latest transatlantic trends as we head into the summit next week, as well as our own GMF Brussels Forum. And with that, I'm going to conclude the session and wish everyone a great rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.